Hey everyone, it's Developer X. Today I'm going to show you guys how to quickly get started with React and Redux. We're going to install all our applications. We're going to get started with a quick create React application. And then we're going to build a quick Redux action reducer and flow. And so let's just get started. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cd into my projects directory. And after I cd into my projects directory, I'm actually going to create a React app. And I'm going to call this React-Redux test, okay? Once that's open, I'm then going to install all my dependencies, and we're going to get started there, okay? So on this side, I'm actually going to go into type in React-Redux example, just so we can kind of see what's going on. So I'm going to look at this examples of Redux, and this is not what I'm looking for, so I'm going to go back over to this to-do list on React, and I'm going to the first thing look at this entry point file. Immediately at this entry point file, a couple of things that stand out to me is that looks like I'm looking using a provider, I'm looking at using a create store, and I'm looking at using something called a root reducer. So after I go into that, I'm going to React Redux test. I'm going to cd into that directory. I'm going to cd there, check out my files. It's all built in Yarn, so I'm going to continue using Yarn. So I'm going to do Yarn add Redux and React Redux. Both of those is what's needed for this application to get started with Redux. Build a React Redux application. Okay, once I got that going, I'm going to open up my code editor, which is Visual Studio Code. And I'm not going to be really using my terminal here anymore. I'm actually going to switch over to having this load into my to be my main terminal. So let me see if I can get this to go to the side. It looks like my Windows key doesn't work anymore, but we'll try that again. So I'm gonna push Control Shift or Control tilde, and that should bring up my terminal here. I'm not going to customize it. I'm just going to use it here. Look at that there. So now I got my PowerShell running locally. So I'm actually going to go to my entry point, which is my index.js. But before we go here, I'm just going to I'm going to open up my terminal, and I'm going to hit yarn start so we can see that it's running locally, and it should just be a basic boilerplate React application. Okay. Now we got it up and running. I'm going to then go back into my code, and I am going to start connecting the Redux store. So as we saw, we need to import the provider and create store, and we need to create something called a root reducer from reducers, okay? So as I'm here, I'm going to import my provider from React Redux. I'm then going to import create store from Redux, and I am then going to import a root reducer from reducers. We'll call it root reducer. Okay. After we do that, I should be set to go, but now I need to connect all these pieces together. If you're looking at this render method, you see that the application is being rendered around the provider component, right? So I'm going to then include a provider component right here, provider, break that out, and then I'm going to place this app inside it. Okay, so now we have this started. There's also something else that we see, that there's a const store, which equals create store, and we're going to pass in the root reducer. Now, we don't have that built, but we have everything else in place. We also need to pass in the property of store, which is also equals store. Okay, here I'm going to, so now we have Redux actually implemented into our React application. Okay, so what did we do? Well, we first built a create React app. After we built the create React app, we imported our libraries that we need. For in our case, it's Redux and React Redux. Now, Redux is the main library, and React Redux is like the glue between React and Redux communicating together. Then we imported the provider and the provider from React Redux, and then we imported the create store method from Redux itself, and now we're applying those all together to wrap our component, our main app component, around a provider component to provide that Redux available through to make Redux available throughout our application. So now we have got started here. One thing that we're still missing is we don't have a root reducer, so I'm going to go ahead and create a root reducer right here called root reducer.js. and I'm going to import that. Just so I can do a good reference, and I'll put this all inside of the description below. I'm going to go look for that reducers file. So here's the to-dos, here's the visibility filter, and here is the combined reducers file, okay? So we have this combined reducers file. The only thing that really stands out to me here that I know I'm going to need is this combined reducers from Redux. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import combined reducers from Redux, and I'm going to use that. So I'm going to export default combined reducers, and I'm going to pass in object, and inside that object it's going to be empty. Well, we need to have, in order for combined reducers to work, we need to have a reducer that we can put into this, right? So it'll work independently if I just had one reducer, but because I know this application might scale and you might have multiple reducers throughout your application, I want to show you guys how to use combined reducers. Okay, so at this point we have our combined reducer set up, our root reducers there. So now I'm going to create something called the app.reducer.js. Okay, so inside this, as you guys can see, we have something called our other reducers, right, where they have it separated inside each individual one. We have a to-dos reducer here, and we have a visibility filter reducer here. Well, I know I'm not going to use the same things, but I know I can use this. So I know I need to make an app reducer. So I'm going to call this app reducer. It's going to be a fat arrow function. And inside that fat arrow function, it's going to take the state and it's going to take the action. Okay. First thing I like to do personally is I like to create an initial state. At this point, we really don't know what our initial state is, so I'm just going to leave it as this. Typically, what you'll see in an application is switch statements. So you'll take a switch statement, which will accept the action.type, and then it'll run through a default case, which will then return the state itself. Okay. Now, what's happening here? Well, right now we're having this app reducer come in. We need to export that default app reducer, and there we go. Now we have created a default reducer, which takes state and an action. And then we're creating a switch statement, which takes the action.type, and I'll show you how that works as we continue on this tutorial. But we're going to use that action.type to determine what we're going to run in our reducer for it to make the changes inside the store itself. Now, this is a pretty basic reducer. So instead of doing a const app reducer, I'm just actually going to do something like this. I'm going to export default, and I'm going to export by default the anonymous function that I'm creating, and I'm going to get rid of this bottom piece here. Okay, so we're good here. So I'm going to do const initial state, which is going to set the initial state for our application. Right now it's an empty object, but it's going to my state is actually going to default to initial state. So here we go. So now we have initial state set up there. So our app now has a reducer key that we can bring in. So since we have our reducer working, since we created a separate reducer for our app, we need to import that reducer into our root reducer and use it here. So I'm going to import app reducer from app reducer. Okay. I like to actually call my files that way. So if I do a fuzzy search, I can type in reducer and I can immediately see what reducer I'm working on and where I want to go to. I don't typically like using my mouse. I like to use my fuzzy search pretty often. So I'll do that with reducers. I'll do that with actions, and I'll do that with those two main things actually mainly when I'm creating a React app. So I'm going to delete that, back out of here. We introduced my app reducer, and now we're going to call this an app key and give it the app reducer value from what's coming back from our app reducer. Okay, so here we go. Now we have our Redux application coming out. So I'm going to load up my inspect element, and obviously I was working with mobile before, and I'm going to open up my console, and there's really nothing there. So how do we know this is working, and how do we know it's all connected? Well, the first thing we know is that the application's still running even with all the changes that we have made. We have introduced a root reducer inside the app. We've introduced a create store and a provider. We've created a new store used from the root reducer, and we've wrapped our app around a provider. Then we give it a property, HTML property, or a prop of store, and we're passing in the return value of create store through our root reducer. So we know this is still all working, and we still have our application up and running. So the question may be, what do we do next, and how do we use this Redux store? Well, inside my app.js, I'm going to import the actual method that we need to use to connect our store into Redux. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is right after our React component, I'm going to import a method called connect, and that is from React-Redux. Now, what this does is this connects our current component with the Redux state, right? So it accepts a couple parameters. The way you use it is you use connect, and then after you connect, you use you immediately invoke the function afterwards. And this first argument 1, is map state to props, right? It's all there. And then the second argument you can leave empty for right now, but it's typically meant for map dispatch to props. So I'm going to then create this const called map state to props. It's going to be a function, and in that function it's going to immediately return an object. This object takes state, and in here I'm going to return app, and that app is going to be state.app because we called it app inside our root reducer. Okay, so once I do this, I will go inside the render function just to make sure it's here, and I will console.warn this.props. Now, what does this do? Okay, well, you'll see that I have an app of an empty array, but it'll be there. But you know, I don't really want it to work that way. So what I would really like to do actually is I would like to break it down and do some and dang, I forgot what this is called. Deconstruction, right? I'm going to deconstruct that object so it belongs under my state. So if I look back at it, that app key is going to be missing. And you'll see I only see dispatch, right? So the rest of it's not there. So what does this mean? Well, typically you'll have something called state, right? And inside that state, here, let's actually create it. Inside that state, we'll have something that says, let's say toggle button, and I'm going to set that to false. And if this is false, I'm going to then take this all out of this app, and right underneath the learn React, I'm going to create something called well, I'm gonna deconstruct the state value. So I'm going to use let toggle button from equals this dot state, and you'll see that I have this toggle button, and in this toggle button, if it is true, I'm going to render I'm going to render this here. I am set to true. Set to true. And if not, I'm using a ternary operator, and inside that I am set to false. Okay. So immediately right now we know it's set to false, right? So there it is. It says I am set to false. I'm actually going to put a at NBSP here, save that out so you at least see a little space in between. I am set to false. Now what? So now we have this thing called toggle button, and it's set to false. Well, I want to use Redux, and I want to replace all my level application, all my state inside app, inside my Redux layer. Now, this is what some people do. Not everybody does this, but just for the sake of this example, I want to take that toggle button and false and place that into my Redux value. Okay, so I'm going to take this key of Redux of toggle button false. I'm going to copy this here, and I'm going to go into my app reducer, and inside my initial state, I'm going to paste that in. So now my initial state has something called toggle button. If I save this and we reload the, we go back into app.js, and underneath this, we're gonna, underneath the toggle button from the state, we're gonna console.warn this.props. Now, if we did everything correctly, toggle button, the toggle button from Redux should show up in this.props. And now you see that. Now you see that we have this toggle button, right? It's set to false. So now I can get rid of this state here. I'm going to delete this. I'm going to get rid of this guy here. And rather than that, I'm going to do a const of toggle button. And I'm going to grab that from this.props. This is just destructuring. I'm grabbing the toggle button from there so I can grab it here, and you'll see it's still set it to false. So rather than using my state value, I'm using the Redux store value that's coming in because I'm destructuring the state.app which is coming from the root reducer and bringing that into our application. And then I'm passing into to the connect function that's brought in from React-Redux that maps this directly into our application and then wraps it inside the app component. So when this app component is loaded, it's loading in with this Redux layer that's taking the state from the Redux store and making it as a prop inside our component layer, making it available for a prop in our component layer. Well, at this point, you're probably wondering, how can I update that value, especially if it's a prop, and how do I go through that cycle? Well, for me, I like to start with the actual actions and take that action and have it go all the way through to the reducers to change everything that's going on, right? To change the value of the store. Now, I'm gonna go into, the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a new file, and I'm gonna call this app.actions.js. And I'm going to do export const, we'll call this toggle button action, and it's going to be equal to a function. And in that function, it's going to return an object, and it has to have a mandatory type. This one is going to be called toggle action or toggle button action. Okay, and all I really need to do is that I'm not carrying a payload, I'm not passing any information into it. All I'm really doing is just saying, hey, I want to send this to the reducer, and when the reducer listens for this type to be called, I want it to then change the toggle from false to true, and vice versa if I push it again, right? So at this point, I've created my action, I've exported the toggle button action. Now I can bring that into my app, and it's gonna do, I have to call that directly in from this, from that actions file. So I'm going to import toggle button action from app.actions, and I'm going to then pass that into the second statement here in my connect function by passing another object through that. So here we are, I'm trying to get to the end here. I'm gonna grab this, I'm gonna call this, pass an object, and I'm gonna call this toggle, toggle action button. And that's gonna equal the toggle button action. So maybe I should change the same name. Toggle button action is equal to toggle button action. So because I wanna use ES6 to break it down for me, it's going to naturally grab that value and give that key value into it. So if I reload this and I look at what's coming back in the props, you'll see that I no longer have a dispatch, but I have this toggle button action. That's the function, which is the action that I created. There's this action that I created that's working through this. It's actually replaced the dispatch, and with these actions that's supposed to be map dispatch to props. So these are the actions that I'm passing through for my Redux layer to get it. Okay, so here I am with this new action. I have connect with Redux, and now I need this Redux layer to I need this Redux action to toggle this button so it goes from set to false to set to true. So where we do this and when we do the manipulation of the store is inside the reducer. So what's really important here is actually copying this type of value right here, this type. Now people usually put this in constants to make it a little bit easier to import and export. You know, for this small example, I'm not going to do that, but you can create a constants and pass the type of a constants through, and that'll work just the same way I'm doing it now. So here we are in our reducer, we got our toggle button that's false, and I want to create a case. I want to create a case here called case, and I'm going to pass in the value that we need for this. And what I'm going to do is return the state. Okay, I'm going to return the state, but inside that state, I'm going to grab the toggle button, and I'm going to change it, state toggle button, and I'm going to set that through. So that should automatically return my state and be true or false, and then it's going to update it inside my Redux store and show it on my screen. So now if I hit save, and I go to this app.js file, there's still no way for me to push this button. There's no button in place here. So right in front of this learn React, I'm going to put a button in there, and I'm going to make it basic, and I'm going to say change Redux store value, and I'm going to pass the onClick method. Well, let's actually break this down. On this onClick method, or on click event, sorry, I'm going to pass in, what did I call it down below? Toggle button action. So it's in my props. I'm going to add it here, toggle button action, save that in there, and on click, I'm going to do toggle button action. Okay, so now technically, if I push this button, it should update that to true. Oh, what happened? Oh no, did I push the wrong button? Oh no. Is this, oh, I'm gonna get rid of this A tag right around this. Okay, so naturally, so if I push this button, you should see that the action's being called and everything's working through the system, and it should be updating our store. So if I save this now and I push this button, you'll see that I am set to true. But if I push it again, I am set to false. So what's going on here, and how are we really doing this? Okay, so let's just follow the code a little bit through. Now, yeah, so let's follow this bit through. So we're grabbing the action from app.actions. We're then passing it on to our map dispatch to props right here as we pass this object with this toggle button action that then maps this action into our props on this component. Once we grab that, we do deconstruction, and we grab that action here. Then on this button, we're adding this onClick method, this onClick event listener, and we're passing in the toggle button action, which means that once I push this button, it's going to call this action. This action is then going to call this app action, which is toggle button action, which is then going to get passed on to our reducer through our actions right here, through our action. It's going to be listening in for the action type. It's going to see what this toggle button action is doing, and what we told it to do to manipulate the store is bring everything back into state, but I want to change the value of toggle button to be the opposite of the current value of the state. And then once that done, updates the store, it re-renders everything on the page. And that's it. That's how we connect React with Redux. That should be everything to run you through from the beginning all the way to the end of getting Redux through. And that's it. Hope this helps.